Chapter 27. From Gross Rosen we were to be moved again, this time to a camp called Dachau, and once more we would walk. It was late in the winter, almost spring, but the ground was still frozen, and the snow hadn't melted. The wooden clogs I wore were terrible for crossing icy patches and clumping through snowdrifts, but I was still better off than those who had lost their shoes, or never had...
Mrs. Ernst, please call 3117. Mrs. Ernst, 3117.
Never had any to begin with. If you could keep good care of your feet in the camps, especially on the marches, you could survive. The sides of the road were littered with dead bodies of Jews who had marched this way before us. They were blue and frozen, lumped into ditches along the side of the road so cars could still pass. The bodies were a constant reminder to us to keep up the pace. As we walked past the frozen corpses, I wondered who else used this road. Somebody else had to, surely. Someone besides the German army. Who were these people who passed the bodies of dead Jews in the ditches every day on their way into town to work? How could they not see what was happening? How could they be all right with this? Along the way, we passed through villages and suburbs. Little houses lined the roads, houses with painted shutters and wreaths on the door. Electric lights lit the windows, and inside we could sometimes see a family sitting down to listen to the radio together, or washing dishes in the kitchen. Every now and then from a doorway hung a Nazi flag, bright red with a black swastika and a white circle. It was warning enough that we should keep our heads down and stay quiet as we passed through. The route from Gross Rosen to Dachau, north of Munich, took us through Czechoslovakia and back into Germany again. Czechoslovakia was still held by Germany. It had been one of the first countries to fall at the start of the war, but the homes we passed now were Czech, not German. Germany had conquered them, but that didn't make them love the Germans anymore. If anything, the Czechs hated their Nazi overlords. There was a change in the SS officers guarding us when we crossed into Czechoslovakia. They still walked like they owned the place, but they were more weary, watching the doorways and crossroads for any sign of trouble. There was no Nazi flags to welcome them here. No Czech revolutionaries jumped out from behind the bushes to free us, but the Czech people fought back in less violent ways. In one little village, there was a bread left on a windowsill. Bread! One of the prisoners saw it and ran for it. Others joined him, and the bread was gone before the Nazis could yell at them to stop. I saw a loaf of bread on the doorstep of another house, but it was gone before I could get it, snatched up by starving prisoners and devoured on the spot. Every Czech village we passed had some little food set out. Not nearly enough for us all, and not nearly enough for those lucky enough to get a bite to eat. But it was something. Farther inside Czechoslovakia, some of the villagers hung out of their windows to throw whatever they had to us. Crusts of bread, half-eaten apples, raw potatoes. The Czechs couldn't share much. There was a war on, after all, and food was hard to come by. But their kindness in the face of the Nazi soldiers and their guns warmed my heart. It was easy to think the worst of humanity when all I saw was brutality and selfishness. And these people showed me there was still good in the world, even if I rarely saw it. The capos took as much of the food as they could for themselves, but a little still made it into the hands and mouths of prisoners. The SS officers were mad about that, but they yelled at the Czechs, not us Jews. "Can't you see we're helping traitors to the fatherland?" they cried. The Czechs didn't care. Germany wasn't their fatherland, and how were we Jews traitors anyway? What had we done after we'd done other than to exist? We marched on for 3 days, and I still hadn't been lucky enough to get any food from the kind-hearted Czechs. I was starving, and I knew I would die of hunger before the cold got me. I was already struggling to keep ahead of the prisoners at the back of the column. Any farther back, I would end up one of the frozen Jews on the side with a bullet in my head. There was a capo in front of me with 4 big loaves of Czech bread slung over his back in a cloth sack. I stared at the bread as I walked, imagining having such a feast, 4 loaves! That bread would go bad before that capo ever ate all 4 loaves. The capos were healthier and better fed than the rest of us. But they were still not fed as well as the Nazis. We couldn't possibly eat that much and not get sick. What if I could talk him into giving me some? Not every capo was a monster. I summoned what little strength I had left and moved up closer to the capo. I couldn't speak to him now, here on the road.
Juliana Barta, please come to the main office. Juliana Barta to the main office.
There were too many other capos around, but maybe if I stayed close to him, made him see me as a real person, the way the Czechs saw us, maybe when I asked him tonight for bread, he would take pity on me and give me some of his hoard. I sidled up alongside the capo, but when I saw his face, I gasped. It was Moonface. Moonface, the capo who had beaten me whenever he could at Bergen-Belsen. Somehow he'd been transferred to Gross-Rosen, and now he was marching south with us to Dachau. Moonface turned and would have seen me, but I quickly backed away. What terrible luck! I wanted to cry again. So much bread, so much more bread than one person needed, and it was Moonface who held it all. Moonface would never give it to me, or to anyone else. He was too cruel. But as I trudged along, I couldn't help staring at that sack of bread. If I didn't get food, by the end of the day I would die. I knew it. My arms shook on their own, and the green spiky leaves and toxic red berries of hollies growing alongside the road started to look appetizing. I'd been eating poisonous fruit. I'd be eating poisonous fruit and bark by nightfall if I didn't get some of that bread. I marched up beside Moonface again, my hunger making me brave. What could Moonface do to me that hunger and the cold weren't already doing? I walked right alongside him until he looked down and saw me. I smiled at him, trying to make him remember me not as the boy he used to punch in the face, but as one of his best workers at Bergen-Belsen. Moonface frowned at me, like he was trying to remember who I was, then ignoring me. I did everything I could to get his attention, short of talking to him. I crossed back and forth in front of him. I walked right beside him on the left and right, matching him step by step. When he walked faster, I walked faster. Even though my feet were sore and frozen, and my legs were so weak, they wanted to quit. I wouldn't let them. Not yet. That night, we stopped in a field. I watched where Moonface went, away from the other capos. Maybe he didn't want to share with them either. Moonface opened his sack and pulled out one of his loaves of bread, and I inched closer. I glanced around to make sure none of the other capos were watching. If they saw me, if they heard what I was about to ask, Moonface would beat me to death. He would have to save face. But Moonface had sat far enough away from the other capos that they didn't notice me. The only people around were the mute living skeletons, my fellow prisoners. I moved close enough to stand over Moonface, and he looked up at me with his scared, pitted, round face. I faltered. This was the face I had avoided so often at Bergen-Belsen. This was the face I had fled to Gross-Rosen to avoid. Moonface would beat me senseless for what I wanted to ask him. But what choice did I have? I cleared my throat and spoke for the first time in days. "Do you remember me?" I croaked. Moonface grunted and tore a bit of bread off with his teeth. "If you remember me," I said, my voice cracking, "then you know I'm a good worker." The other prisoners on the ground around us looked up at me with wide eyes. They must have been thinking the same thing I had, that Moonface would kill me just for talking to him. I pushed on before my courage left me. I want to work, but I won't make it on the march another day if I don't get some bread. I haven't eaten in 3 days, and I was hoping you could give me some." Moonface stared at me, his mouth slowly chewing on the bread like a cow working its cud. I would like to be able to work," I told him, "but I can't work without food." Moonface laid his bread aside and pulled out a knife. He stood and put it against my throat. I tried not to flinch, but I could feel where the knife nicked my skin. Blood from the cut ran down my neck. The prisoners around me seemed to hold their breath, waiting for me to die. Or maybe it was me holding my breath. I couldn't tell. All I could do was stand there, as tall and strong as possible, and wait for Moonface to decide my fate. Moonface held the knife against my neck, staring into my eyes. I stared right back, showing him how strong I was, showing him I wasn't afraid to die. Neither of us blinked. Another long minute went by. If he was going to kill me, I wished he would just get it over with. I was ready to scream. At last, Moonface pulled his knife away from my neck, and I breathed again. To my amazement and to the amazement of the other prisoners watching us, Moonface got a hunk off the loaf with his knife and tossed the bread to me. A murmur of surprise went through the prisoners around us, but Moonface silenced them with a glare. I nodded my thanks to the big ugly capo and hurried away before he changed his mind and killed me. My heart was racing as I found a place to lie down and eat. With shaking fingers, I tore off a piece and lifted it to my cracked lips. No bread had ever tasted so good in my life. I wanted to eat it all right then and there, but there was no telling how much farther we would have to walk. I had to save as much as I could. Moonface had found it in his heart to be generous for once, but for whatever reason, but just this once.